Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. My name is Neil Trotter, the host of the YouTube channel. We do philosophy videos, primarily videos about philosophical texts. We read the quotes from philosophy texts, and then we do supplementary commentary. I add that, and also we viewers contribute to the commentary below in the comments section. And today, what we're going to be talking about is a book. It's called Freedom is a Constant Struggle. It's by Angela Y. Davis, and the subtitle is Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundation of a Movement. So Angela Davis, right, very famous critical theorist, I would say, pretty big name philosopher, I think so. Some of her famous works are Prisons Obsolete, Women, Race, and Class. I've covered quite a few of her texts on this channel, and this is one of them. This is actually a collection of speeches that she's done, along with some essays, I believe, and some interviews. It was released in 2016, right? So not too long ago, but a few years ago, right? And we're talking Palestine, we're talking Ferguson, and these two things, sadly, still very prevalent in the news today. We're just talking about Ferguson, we're talking about criminal justice and its corruption, and the killings of unarmed black people, and the perpetuation of the criminal justice system against people of color, and how that props up an elite class and continues to maintain social inequality. And of course, we're talking Palestine here with that whole thing that's going on right now, the war with Israel against Hamas, and that whole a horrible situation going on there in Gaza. And there's some clear parallels going on with those two, and Angela Davis makes those parallels and also includes a lot of other things, which we'll talk about. So let me read you some quotes here. Right off the bat, I'm gonna pick, this is actually from the introduction here. This is page from the editor of the book, Frank Barat. And this is page Roman numeral 11 XI, starting at the last paragraph of that page. It is easy to feel discouraged and simply let go. There is no shame in that. We are, after all, engaged in a struggle that seems, if we look at it using a mainstream political framework and through a mass media prism, unwinnable. And he's talking about the social justice movement, fighting against these institutions of oppression, like our current criminal justice system, the military-industrial complex, these large entities that perpetuate social inequality and imperialism, and these big things. And so it just doesn't seem like we could win against these enormous machines of social inequality. But he continues, on the other hand, if we take a step back, look at things from a broader angle, reflecting on what is happening all over the world and the history of struggle, the history of solidarity movements, it becomes clear that sometimes even obvious that seemingly indestructible forces can be, thanks to people's willpower, sacrifices, and actions, easily broken. Right? And that's true. And so we're talking about freedom is a constant struggle, right? We have to fight against a lot of the crap that's going on in society today, and it seems like huge. But just look back at society, and some people, it's easy to fall into the trap of not only thinking that these things are too big to fight against, it's also easy to fall into the trap of, things have they really changed? For example, American slavery, has that really gone away with the criminal justice system, and the fact that most people behind bars in America are people of color, and then that people who are behind bars are forced to do labor, and that whole thing, like, it's a kind of slavery, right? So people look at those kinds of situations, and it's like, have things really changed? And of course they have, right? And stuff like slavery and Jim Crow, women's rights, queer rights, we have gone a long way, and these things used to be seen as impossible to overcome, right? It's one of the reasons why I read so much, right? Because there was a time in America where it was illegal for Black people to read, right? That was illegal, right? And there was harsh punishments for that, right? But thank God, right now, with the help of people's willpower, sacrifices, and actions, that's no longer the case, right? I can read now, so I read a lot, and that's part of the motivation why I read, because I remember, there was a time when it was illegal for people like me to do that. So things have changed, and that's part of how we need to look at this. It is possible, but let's explore further in that vein of thinking. Okay, this is page 3, and it's the last paragraph. Black feminism emerged as a theoretical and practical effort demonstrating that race, gender, and class are inseparable in the social worlds we inhabit. Okay, so we're talking about feminism, but specifically Black feminism. All right, so I'll continue here, page 4, starting on the 5th line. We are still faced with the challenge of understanding the complex ways race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and ability are intertwined, but also how we move beyond these categories to understand the interrelationships of ideas and processes that seem to be separate and unrelated. Insisting on the connection between struggles and racism in the US and struggles against the Israeli repression of Palestinians, we're already going there, in this sense is a feminist process. So we're talking about interconnection of struggle, okay? So, and I put in my notes here, intersectionality, okay, part of Black feminism, is key to understanding huge societal problems, right? And so I put that there because, I'm a huge proponent for philosophy, right? And of course, philosophy isn't the end-all be-all, right? It's not the only thing to solve the problem. We also have to act. Activism is key, but it's important. Theory is important too, and we gotta really understand the meaning behind these forms of oppression and discrimination, right? And so when you think about things like intersectionality, what that is an attempt to really understand what's going on in terms of how oppression is expressed in society, right? And that's important, right? Because you really do need to understand what's going on for you to make effective change. So when we talk about philosophy of feminism, right? There's feminism. What is many things, right? It depends on who you ask and which feminist you're talking to. But when we talk about the philosophy of feminism, now we're getting into we're analyzing okay, why is there different forms of feminism or different expressions of feminism? Why does it depend on who we're talking to? And you start getting into further ideas like intersectionality. And so in that way, feminism becomes more effective, right? And it can be used as a tool to help combat oppression and discrimination. And plus, Black feminism, intersectionality, these are concepts that have, they're not new concepts, right? They've been developed in the past. So yeah, we're looking historically too. Like the first quote is talking about looking at the past and seeing what we can use from the past to help us in our current struggle now. So I'll read you this third quote that I picked here from the book. Yeah, this is page 11. And it's Angela Davis being interviewed, and one of the interview questions is the struggle endless? Like the struggle for freedom? And Angela Davis says, I would say that as our struggle mature, they produce new ideas, new issues, and new terrains on which we engage in the quest for freedom. So in that way, freedom is a constant struggle because it matures. And so this is when we start talking about the interconnectedness of social justice, when you begin to realize, feminism, for example, we're using it as an example. Feminism is for women's rights, right? But then you start thinking, well, what does it even mean to be a woman? And like, you know, and then you start thinking about this whole idea of gender, and then gender equality, and the fact that we have gender inequality, where, you know, some people don't identify as a woman or a man, non-gender conforming, non-binary people, right? Transgender, right? And these are both aspects of femininity as well as masculinity. And it starts getting complex, but it's interconnected. And then we start like talking about racism and how that is, there's an interplay between that and gender. And then you start throwing in class and you start realizing, wait a minute, like there's this interconnection going on between class and race and gender, and then just keeps going, right? And so as we learn the interconnection between different forms of oppression, right? In that way, freedom is this constant struggle. It isn't so much like, oh, this is such a slog. It's more like, oh, we're starting to learn like the states of what it means to be, like the states of being, and how we are hindering states of being. So it's like this informational quest, right, of discovery, right? Is how you gotta look at it. You know, unfortunately, we do have violence that exists in society that does oppress and discriminate to maintain the status quo that blocks being. So, you know, the quest becomes horrible at times because of that. But it still is this inquiry, this philosophical inquiry, and we can't lose sight of that. So let's talk about the application of philosophy with social justice work, right? So here's page 15. This is, I think, yeah, the last sentence. Here we go. The major challenge of this period is to infuse a consciousness of the structural character of state violence into the movements that spontaneously arise. So it's important to understand, like, when these forms of oppression and state violence arise, like what's going on in the Middle East and in Israel currently, you know, presently with the war that's going on with Israel versus Hamas, United States, Israel against Palestine, right? What's going on there? Like, what's going on there? Like, nothing happens in a vacuum. Things happen because of other things that have happened in the past, right? And how is this connected with the past and with other forms of oppression? Now we're starting to build a consciousness, right? Of, you know, we're being consciously aware of the complexities of the situation and their interconnectedness with other situations. And this gives us an effective way to fight or oppose these this state violence or these forms of oppression. But I'll continue page 16, last sentence. The problem is that it is often assumed that eradication of the legal apparatus is equivalent to the abolition of racism. Okay, we're talking about racism. But racism persists in a framework that is far more expansive, far vaster than the legal framework. Economic racism continues to exist. Racism can be discovered at every level in every major institution, including the military, the healthcare system, and the police. All you got to do is hook up with a statistician, like you know, or somebody who studies like economics, and they can throw you some facts and figures on that one. Okay, it's not easy to eradicate racism that is so deeply entrenched in the structures of our society, and this is why it's important to develop an analysis that goes beyond an understanding of individual acts of racism. Right? We got to look at it as a systemic issue, as an institutional problem, right? Not just like acts of individual hatred. And this is why we need demands that go beyond the prosecution of individual perpetrators. Right? That's important. Let me skip down to the end of page 17. Racism is so dangerous because it does not necessarily depend on individual actors, but rather is deeply embedded in the apparatus, right? And it's not just racism, it's like xenophobia. I mean, you know, it's ableism, right? It's all the forms of discrimination, the isms and the obias. It's not just individuals like discriminating, it's an entire system our institutional structures. Like, where I live, Memphis, Tennessee. I mean, I'm from California, and where San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a lot more ramps and just access for people in wheelchairs, for instance, or people who have mobility issues, right? But here in Memphis, it's like there's so many places that don't have ramps or access or ability for people in wheelchairs or people who struggle with mobility issues to like access entrances, right? So that's ableism, right? Now, is that like an issue of people like, I don't like people in wheelchairs, or I don't like handicapped people? Like, is it people saying that? Like, is that what's going on? No, it's like, it's a structural problem. It's like a problem of civil engineering, right? A lack of civil engineers and urban developers acknowledging that there's different kinds of people with different mobility accesses around, right? And what's going on there? Like, why is that a thing? Like that's the thing that we need to be focusing on, right? Rather than like, well, I don't see that happening. There's nobody yelling at, down with the cripples. There's nobody. I don't see that happening. So what is this whole thing about discrimination against people with mobility issues? Well, that's not the primary form of how people with mobility issues are discriminated against, right? It's more the societal structures that are doing it, right? And you could go on and on with different forms of discrimination and why we need to rethink how these forms are actually being manifested and implemented. Okay, this is on page 27. Respect to feminist struggles, men will have to do a lot of the important work. I often like to talk about feminism not as something that adheres to bodies, not as something grounded in gendered bodies, but as an approach, as a way of conceptualizing, as a methodology, as a guide to strategies for struggle. That means that feminism doesn't belong to anyone in particular. Feminism is not a unitary phenomena. So it's like, feminism, that's only for women. That's about women's issues. It's like, no, it's a way of looking at society. It's a lens. It's like a method of critique. It's an approach of fighting for greater forms of being, right? That's what feminism is in the philosophical sense. So this is the end of page 29. Changing the narrative. Right. Sometimes we have to do the work, even though we don't yet see a glimmer on the horizon that it's actually going to be possible, right? Sometimes we just got to do it. You're like, I don't see a way of solving this problem. It's like, well, just because you don't see a way of doing it doesn't mean you should just, give it a shot. Sometimes we just got to do that, And I think one of the ways we can do that is we got to realize that struggles are interconnected and they're interdependent. So what you may be fighting for, whether it's like access for people with mobility issues, or transgender rights, or ending the criminal justice system oppression of people of color, specifically black people, but all people of color, right? These things are interconnected, right? So you can find solidarity and mutual aid through the various struggles. You might think like, I don't know how to do it, but maybe I can see another social struggle and I can get some sort of help or some sort of vision of, this is how I do it, right? And then you even look at what we were talking about before with the historical context. It's like, well, maybe I can look at the past and see how other people did it when it seemed like it was impossible for them. I read you page 41. This is the second paragraph, second line. Solidarity always implies a kind of mutuality. And I skip down some lines. We share our experiences. Experiences are shared. They're not in isolation, okay? I skip down some more lines. The whole notion of intersectionality, okay, cannot simply look at gender in isolation from race, from class, from sexuality, from nationality, from ability, from a whole range of other issues, okay? That's so part of the issue, part of the problem is when we look at these insurmountable problems, we're seeing it in a limited way. We're only seeing the race side of it, or we're only seeing the class side of it, or we're only seeing the gender inequality side of it, but we're not like seeing the interrelation and the interconnectedness of the problem. And once you start seeing that, you're like, that will help you out in terms of, oh, okay, I actually have a lot of support here, or I have a lot of tools that I can use, whether it's different people in the struggle or different methodologies, right, that can be applied in unison, right? Because ultimately you are fighting the same problem. It's just being manifested in these different ways. So let's continue, like, in different ways. What kind of ways? Like, how is this all interconnected? This is page 45. 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph. Well, I think that we constantly have to make connections so that when we are engaged in the struggle against racist violence in relation to Ferguson, Michael Brown, and New York, Eric Garner, we can't forget the connections with Palestine. So in many ways, I think we have to engage in an exercise of intersectionality, of always foregrounding these connections so that people remember that nothing happens in isolation. That when we see the police repressing protests in Ferguson, we also have to think about the Israeli police and the Israeli army repressing protests in occupied Palestine. Right. So this was written in, or this was published in 2016, right? The city I live in, Memphis, Tennessee, after this was published, you had the horrific instance of police violence against Tyree Nichols that ultimately ended in his death, right? Just another example, famous example, but of what's already been going on. And then you might say, well, what does that have to do with what's going on in Palestine? Well, our current police chief, the Memphis police chief, got her training. She was trained in Israel. She got advanced police training from Israel, and the tactics that she learned there, the police chief here in Memphis, Tennessee, is the exact same tactics they implement in Israel against people in Palestine, the police force in Israel, or the military over there, right? The same, see how it's interconnected? So when we're looking at this kind of state violence, we have to understand, exactly what Davis is saying. Like, when you are protesting for Palestine, like, you're also protesting against police violence here in the United States of America, because it's all the same, right? It's all the same discrimination. It's just situated in different areas. So by uniting in that struggle, we are able to form more power. And this is page 47, 3rd paragraph, 7th line. We cannot assume that it is possible to be victorious in any anti-racist movement as long as we don't consider how gender and sexuality and class and nationality figure into those struggles. Okay, it's not just racism, right? We're also talking about gender. It's all interconnected. Different identifiers are used to other people, and by othering, you prop up an elite class, right? That's the whole point of othering. The ultimate goal of othering is really is a form of exploitation, right? Because when you other somebody, you favor another person, right? And in this way, we have capitalists or patriarchs, powerful, heterosexual, white, older men, right? Page 48 here. This is the 3rd paragraph. Well, I think the interconnectedness of anti-racist movements with gender is crucial, but we also need to do this with class, nationality, and ethnicity. I don't think that we can imagine black movements in the same way today as we once did. The assumption that black freedom was freedom for the black man created a certain kind of border around the black struggle which can no longer exist. So I think that the black radical tradition has to embrace the struggles against anti-Muslim racism, which is perhaps the most virulent form of racism today. It makes no sense to imagine eradicating anti-black racism without also eradicating anti-Muslim racism. because those anti-Muslim racism and anti-black racism, they work in tandem, they work in parallel. You know, the two are mutually propping each other up, right? And when you oppose one, you oppose the other, right? But you got to make that connection for that to happen, that joint opposition to occur. This is page 49, second paragraph. I don't think we have any alternative other than remaining optimistic. Right? Got to be optimistic. Optimism is an absolute necessity, even if it's only optimism of the will. As Gramsci said, Gramsci, good quotation there, good credit there, and pessimism of the intellect. Okay, and then we skip down to third to last line. A time when neoliberalism attempts to force people to think of themselves only in individual terms and not in collective terms. It is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. Okay, so yeah, that's important. As Davis is saying, we got to be optimistic. And so a counter would be like, how the hell do you stay optimistic in these times? It's like, you do it through collectivities, right? You know, don't put so much weight on individuals. You say, you know, this is a collective struggle. And that's where the hope starts coming in. So let me read you quote number 8 that I picked in here. As I wonder, I'm sorry. This is page 66, and this is the third paragraph. As I wonder, will we ever truly recognize the collective subject of history that was itself produced by radical organizing? We talk about not only collective organizing, but we're talking about organizing from the past. Collective organizing from the past, or the history of collective organizing. Okay, and let me skip down to the 5th paragraph. How can we counteract the representation of historical agents as powerful individuals, powerful male individuals, in order to reveal the part played by, for example, by black women, domestic workers in the Black freedom movement? You know, and this is a known truth, right? You see like social justice movements, and a lot of contribution that women did is not emphasized, or it's like not even known, right? We just focus on, you know, the figureheads, which are primarily men. But let me continue. Regimes of social segregation were not de-established because of the work of leaders and presidents and legislatures, but rather because of the fact that ordinary people adopted a critical stance in the way in which they perceived their relationship to reality. Social realities that may have appeared inalterable, impenetrable, came to be viewed as malleable and transformable, and people learned how to imagine what it might mean to live in a world that was not so exclusively governed by the principle of white supremacy. This collective consciousness, she's just dropping the dimes, emerged within the context of social struggles, okay? And we go back to like, well, sometimes you just gotta move when you don't think there's, you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. You gotta imagine that light, right? You gotta create that light. You know, there needs to be more creativity and imagination in social justice work, right? And the people that were successful in social justice work, they were the ones who were creative and imaginative. And, you know, they didn't let the inalterable, impenetrable vision of the time stop them. You know, they were like artists in their social justice activism, right? It doesn't have to just be white supremacy, right? It doesn't have to be just hyper patriarchy, but it's collective. An individual doesn't just come up with that. It's like a group of people, you know, and then groups of people, you know, groups of people, you know, that's when it starts happening. Okay, we're on page 67, and this is the 3rd paragraph. It's the second to last line. This amazing collective imagination of a future world without racial and gender and economic oppression. That's the one. That's the one, right? Yeah, so it's history. It's looking at the past and seeing how other people who were successful, who toppled down, like for example, Jim Crow, or the apartheid in like South Africa, for instance, or the British imperial rule of India, right? You look at Gandhi, but it wasn't just Gandhi, right? There was all types of other people involved. Of course, you don't want to diminish the contributions of like these individuals, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. But sometimes we think like, we need another Malcolm X, we need a Dr. King, and we're just waiting for like a Superman figure, right? But it just doesn't work like that, right? It's like, it's many people behind the scenes. Of course, oftentimes you'll see these figureheads come out, or these leaders that are just kind of pushed into the forefront, for better or worse. But it's many people working together to create these massive changes that increase social equality and defeat like exploitation and state violence. I'll read you this quote that highlights that even more so. This is page 84, second paragraph, fourth line. Recognize that we have to focus our attention beyond individuals and symbols in order to develop a fluency capable of apprehending the persistence of structural racism, even when legalized segregation has been declared historically obsolete, even when individual expressions of racist attitudes are not so easily condoned. Of course, it is a good thing that the Confederate flag is finally on its way out. After more than 50 years of openly symbolizing resistance to civil rights, resistance to black equality, and anti-black and anti-Semitic violence, the Confederate flag finally seems to be disappearing from our official political landscapes. But the question confronting us is how to identify and challenge structures as well as symbols of racism. It's not just tearing down the Confederate flags and the Confederate war hero statues, right? I mean, that's good, but we also gotta okay, now the next step is we gotta take down these systems, like these institutional forms of oppressions, like our healthcare system, right? Not like, I wouldn't say, some people would be like, yeah, we gotta blow it up, like a Fight Club type of thing. Like, no, I mean, we gotta be intelligent about it, right? We gotta look at our systems of oppression, like the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, and look at like how there's racism in that, and it's not just individual, it's institutional. And you can go on our education system, and we gotta start like dealing with that. An example in the education system currently in the state where I live, Tennessee, they got a ban on books about racial history and about like queer identity. Right? I mean, that's like clear discrimination, and it's a institutional thing. It's a systemic thing, right? It's not just an individual going around saying like, I want these books out of my school. Like, I'm sure like this is probably on the ban list, I would imagine, right? It may or may not be, I'm not sure, but I do know like if you were to like, a teacher were to try to use this book to teach their like maybe 5th grade, 4th grade class, that's not gonna fly. Like, they're gonna be some state officials gonna be like, no. And that's just clear forms of oppression. And this is what we got to realize. But let's keep going with this idea. This is page 104, third paragraph. Feminism involves so much more than gender equality, and it involves so much more than gender. Feminism must involve a consciousness of capitalism. So here we go with this interconnectedness again. I mean, the feminism that I relate to, and there are multiple feminisms, right? Mm-hmm. It has to involve a consciousness of capitalism and racism and colonialism and post-colonialities and ability and more genders than we can even imagine and more sexualities than we ever thought we could name. Feminism has helped us not only to recognize a range of connections among discourses and institutions and identities and ideologies that we often tend to consider separately, but it has also helped us to develop epistemological, now we're starting to get philosophical terms here, and organizing strategies that take us beyond categories of woman and gender. And feminist methodologies impel us to explore connections that are not always apparent. And they drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions. Feminism insists on methods of thought and action that urge us to think about things together that appear to be separate, and to disaggregate things that appear to naturally belong together. Now that's something J.K. Rowling needs to read, right? She needs to read, like, those kind of feminists need to like check that section out, right? Feminism is about like recognizing the interdependence and interconnectivity of many kinds of identities and identifiers of being, which is one of the things that's pushed in the theory of intersectionality, or highlighted, I would say, or showcased. So again, let's talk about why history is important in terms of the social struggle. All right. This is page 116. Let's see, second paragraph, 6th line. In the 1960s, we confronted issues that should have been resolved in the 1860s. And what does Angela Davis mean here? She's talking about, like, when the Civil War happened and black people were freed afterwards. And there was the Emancipation Proclamation and Black Reconstruction, but that didn't go too well, right? Because there was a system of oppression came about, not Jim Crow, and also the criminal justice system ramped up and formed these other forms of slavery. So we kind of had this continuation, right? That if you looked at it historically, you would have got clues as to how to deal with the struggle, right? That's what she's talking about. But let me continue reading. And I'm making this point because what happens when 2060 rolls around? Will people still be addressing the same issues? And I also think it's important for us to think forward and to imagine future history in a way that is not restrained by our own lifetimes. Another important thing, right? History is vast and our lives are short, relatively speaking. When we look at the vastness of history. Oftentimes people say, well, if it takes that long, I'll be dead. So what? Everybody dies, right? And if people who were involved in the struggle against slavery, I'm thinking about people like Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells in the struggle against lynching, if they had that narrow individualistic sense of their own contributions, where would we be today? And so we have to learn how to imagine a future in terms that are not restricted to our own lifetimes, right? That's the other thing. When we get into this rut of, I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, this looks like this is an impossible thing to overcome. And it's like, well, are you only limiting the victory of this problem within your own lifetime? Right? Are you thinking about it that individualistically? Or should you look at it more holistically and be like, will my contribution affect the world decades from now, like a century from now? And you might say, like, well, I mean, you're not that important. You are that important, right? People do things that have impact centuries from now, right? And it isn't just like, Beethoven or like Frederick Douglass or like these grand historical figures. It's average people, right, that come together and do things, and we see ripple effects. And that's how you gotta look at it. Okay, so this is page 120. It's the last paragraph. I find it so interesting that certain moments in the history of Black freedom struggle can be very easily incorporated into a larger narrative of the struggle for democracy in this country. And then there are others that get completely ignored. I don't think that there is a single person in this country who doesn't know the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. Probably very few people in the world who don't know his name, and that's wonderful. That's wonderful. But let me skip down to page 121, the 9th to the last line on that page. There's a reason why most people never have the opportunity to look at the Black Panther Party 10-point program, because those points are still very much on the agenda today. Like, everybody knows Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like for the most part, but who actually knows the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party, which is, Black Panther Party is had a major influence on social justice. Despite what you may or may not heard, so many people have been influenced, and the struggle for social justice and the fight against social inequity, that the Black Panther Party had a huge influence on that, right? And you're still seeing a lot of that influence today in modern fights against social inequity. And Black Panther Party is still around. There's one highly active in Memphis, the city I'm in, but nobody knows. Barely anybody knows the 10-point program. Why? And Angela Davis is saying, well, it's because they're still very much on the agenda today. Those aspects of the struggle that are incorporated into the official narrative of American democracy are aspects that can be considered to have achieved their own closure. So Black people have civil rights, so it's no longer necessary to struggle for civil rights. Thus, the struggle for freedom can be relegated to the past. But of course, this isn't true. The struggle cannot be relegated to the past, because when you look at struggles from the past that still relate today, people are like, I don't know about that, because there's a reason why they don't want you to know about that. Same reason why these kinds of books are banned in public schools, right? It's that kind of thing. It's like if people start realizing, oh wait, this actually applies to today, people start like making those kind of historical connections, that these struggles are interconnected and they're relevant, and they're not like issues of the past, but actually his issues of the past are issues of the present, right? When people start doing that, then people begin to rise up. And see, that's where the optimism and the hope comes from, is from making those connections. And this is page 123. This is the seventh to last line of the first paragraph. By this time, everybody who may have been hoping that Obama was the Messiah realized that he was simply the President of the United States of America. Simply the President of the racist, imperialist United States of America. And of course, we're all hoping that things will turn out better during this term. And so this is 2016, when it was published. So they were talking about Obama's second term. But they won't if we don't stand up and do the work we're required to do. Right? One man, right? That whole thing, like, oh, Obama's gonna save the world. He's the Superman, right? But history and reality doesn't work like that, right? And even the President of the United States has very limited influence. The President of the United States has a lot of influence, don't get me twisted, but even that president can only do so much. And what Davis highlights, well, he's president of a country that's racist, that's imperialist, right? That's hyper-capitalist, right? It's dealing with its own discrimination and oppression, and that discrimination and oppression is integrated into the very functionality of the country. So he's working with a limited apparatus, right? Okay, so this is the top of page 125. I try to use a feminist approach that allows me to work the contradiction so that I can be supportive of Obama, and I can also be extremely critical of him at the same time. She's a critical theorist, so she's looking not at the world in black and white, but she's seeing the levels of gray there. I am critical of the extent to which our political discourse has become so flat. For example, we can't even talk about working class people anymore. When did everybody become middle class? And even those of us who might objectively be middle class can still identify with the working class. You gotta recall, Angela Davis used to be a member of the Communist Party. So, she's very knowledgeable about like communist theory and all that. So, she's all about working class in that term and using it effectively. There's something wrong with the fact that we cannot talk about the working class. Oh, I already said that. I was talking about opening up the discursive terrain to be able to talk about capitalism. This means we have to reintroduce the working class into our discourses. Poor people. If you can't talk about the working class, how can you talk about poor people? How can you talk about unemployed people? How can you talk about all of the people who've become a part of surplus populations created by global capitalism and the processes of deindustrialization that first began to happen in the 1980s? So we also have to talk about immigrant rights, because immigrant rights are very much linked to that process of globalization. Again, like she's just making these interconnections. And she's saying, look, if you know, nothing is in isolation. But let me continue. Page 126, the top. It may be that marriage equality is important as a civil rights issue, but we need to go further than simply applying heteronormative standards to all people who identify as members of the LGBT community. As a matter of fact, what was so exciting about the gay rights movement during its feminist phase, I would say, was its critique of marriage, especially since the institution of marriage was used in an ideological, oppressive way. So, you know, looking at this situation in interconnected terms, but also looking at the complexity of it. You know, gay people fought for marriage rights, but they're like, wait, hold the phone, right? It's important for social inequality, but understand that marriage as an institution has been used to perpetuate social inequality, right? Because it's very heteronormative, right? So these are the things we have to consider. But let me skip down 4 lines. When I say critique of marriage, I'm not talking about a critique of relations, of intimacy and emotional connections, and the ties that we feel with people with whom we would like to spend our lives. Like, so don't get it twisted. She's not talking about that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the institution, underline, as a capitalist institution that's designed to guarantee the distribution of property. I mean, that's pretty much why I got married. I'm married to my wife and I love my wife, but once you get married, you get all these state bonuses. Right? Like, it's easier to apply for a house, a mortgage, insurance. All this whole state apparatus becomes more in your favor. Healthcare and all that. You can, if you have a healthcare plan, you can extend it to your spouse, but you need to be married or whatever. The state needs to recognize your relationship, right? And it's just this tool used to oppress, right? That's what she's talking about. But I'll continue. Skip down 6 lines. Immigrant rights are so important, and it's not just about the DREAM Act and paths to citizenship. It's about welcoming the people who do so much of the labor that fuels the economy. The agricultural labor, the service labor, people who perform the labor that Black people use to perform. This should be considered a part of Black history and a part of the Black freedom struggle. The intersectionality of social justice. Okay, I just wrote that. But yeah, looking at immigration rights and saying, like, it's the same thing as the struggle for Black freedom. Right? It's the same thing. It's just like manifesting in a different way, because you can make that connection with the economy and how, like, well, Black people used to do this work. Now this work is being delegated to immigrants. And so that's how we have this connection, that we should be fighting together, because as we're dealing with this same kind of oppression. That's all she's saying. Let me read you this final quote. This is page 144, second paragraph, 7th line. The greatest challenge facing us as we attempt to forge international solidarities and connections across national borders is an understanding of what feminists often call intersectionality. Not so much intersectionality of identities, but intersectionalities of struggles. Intersectionality of struggles. And that's how freedom is a constant struggle. And she's saying that not in like, oh, damn, freedom is a constant struggle. No, she's saying, like, realize freedom is a constant struggle because it's the struggle is interconnected and is related to so many different kinds of struggle, like the struggle for gender equality, the struggle to end ableism, even like things like fat phobia, the fight against patriarchy, right? The fight against capitalism gone awry, like hyper-capitalism, the fight against classism. You know, you just keep going and going and going, because there's all these forms of oppression that work in tandem to keep people down. And so she's trying to let you know, Angela Davis is like, look, you got to see this struggle not in this one dimension. It's a multi-dimensional thing, right? And that's where you can, where the hope comes from, and that's when the ability to see, like, oh, this is how we fight this. This is how we deal with this problem. We combine forces. We join together. Because it's ultimately we're all getting oppressed by this interconnected network of oppression, right? And so there's hope there. There's optimism that I would like to push forward. So, you know, this is a great book if you're just kind of struggling with what's going on in the world today, and you're like, damn, you know, I don't know. I think the world's just gonna go to hell in a handbasket. I don't know what to do. Yeah, read this book. It might give you some hope and be like, oh, okay. I see what I can do here. I see how I can, like, you know, impact and make a difference for the better. So I would highly encourage you to check that book out. Well, you've been listening and watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.